Okay, so you love houseplants, but do you know what all the different components that go into your soil mix actually do in terms of helping your plants? Stick around with me and let's dive into it. Hi, my name is Memo. This is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me. It's tropical houseplants. So this is going to be a continuation of my plant science series. I have got a playlist and I will link it at the top there. I've covered topics such as photosynthesis, mycorrhizal fungi, light levels for house plants, fertilizing, all of the good sciencey bits. And today, as this was a request by one of the viewers, we're going to dive into looking at your kind of growing media. Not necessarily just for people growing in kind of more soil type media, but also semi-hydro. We'll do both because we'll look at components, what they do, what they don't do, and things to be aware of. This video should help people understand a bit more about how a lot of the houseplants, a large number of them being aroids, but not all of them being aroids, perform and how they grow essentially in nature. And realistically, what we're doing with most houseplants is trying to fake it. We're trying to make it seem like these plants are still where they are meant to be growing and growing happily. So that's why it's key to know all the different components, because it's not as simple as saying, you know what, all of the tropical jungle floors or all of the tropical nooks and crannies on trees and those kind of big jungles are exactly the same. There are going to be differences. It's not just going to be pure up soil. Most of the time it isn't. But these are things that you need to consider when you're looking at the right soil mix, the right soil components to add into your own mix, or maybe what mix you need to be buying if you're buying pre-mixed. Because you need to also remember there's a difference between something like an aroid, which is potentially epiphytic, which means it grows on the side of trees, versus a tropical plant that might be growing terrestrially, so down at the soil level. There's going to be different needs to what those plants are used to seeing. If I'm not mistaken, I think I have done a video about kind of epiphytic plants versus terrestrial plants, and I will add that in this video as well at the top. In this video, we're going to be looking at what all of these components do. The usual suspects, kind of a bit of the mineral crew. The mineral crew will be more for the kind of materials that you're using for your semi-hydro. Additives that you might be adding into potentially soil mixtures and what they actually do and how all of this comes together. So without further ado, let's dive into the first topic. So I know this might seem like a relatively straightforward one, but what does a growing media actually need to do? So whether it's semi-hydro or whether it is just a regular soil type growing media. Anybody know? Feel free to put it in the comments down below. I'm not testing you, I swear, I'm not testing you, but it is one of those things that is good to sometimes go back to the basics, because this is something that we need to refresh our minds when we're thinking about the growing media that we're putting our plants into. So, first things first, and possibly the most important thing, is aeration. Roots of nearly, if I'm not mistaken, pretty much most plants on the planet need to have air available to them. Very few plants, there are a few select plants, I'm thinking more the kind of marshy plants, and I think even they need it to a certain point, but very few plants can survive in completely air-free soil medias, because essentially their roots will suffocate, as far as I'm understanding it. The other big thing that's obvious is to provide moisture or water to the plant itself. It is one of the key things that all plants need in order to survive. They need water. And again, the third thing might be again glaringly obvious, but it still needs to be said. They need to anchor the plant down. If there isn't something for the plant's roots to hold onto, the plant will just flop around and it will not stabilize itself. It needs something to anchor in. So, aeration, water, and to keep it rigid, to keep it anchored into whatever it's growing. But let's make this into a bit more of a real world scenario, especially if we're looking at something like epiphytic plants, which a lot of our houseplants tend to be epiphytic. I'll show you an example here. This is an epiphytic fern. And people that have been here for a while know not all ferns are terrestrial ferns. But these plants, any epiphytic plant, isn't growing in the ground. So again, a bit of like etymological background on this, and that is kind of where the word originates from. So epi in Greek, in ancient Greek, means upon, and phytic, upon a plant. Physi or phyto. Physi is nature, phyto is plant. So epiphytically, it means upon a plant or upon nature. So a lot of these plants will be growing up the side of trees, nooks and crannies, anything that they can kind of grasp onto. But what does that tell us? And I know a lot of people have covered this. This is not going to be the dense. If you think of your garden soil, something that's a bit more dense, that's not what these plants are growing into. They're growing into very airy spaces with a bit of leaf debris, maybe some broken bark and bits and things that are decomposing. But there is an awful lot of air in those kind of pockets that they're growing on the side of trees and things like that. So that is something you need to consider when choosing the components to whatever soil mixture you're giving to these plants. So I've got another example here. This is an aglaonema. These are terrestrial plants, which means they are used to growing in the ground, which means they have got different requirements. They're more used to slightly more dense soil. It doesn't mean no air. See the first point that we were talking about earlier on. So they still need aeration, but they are used to slightly denser medias. They're used to having a lot of nutrients available to them all of the time versus what you might get with an epiphytic plant. Because the epiphytic plant, something that's growing in the nooks and crannies of trees, is relying on whatever debris is decomposing within that pocket that they've kind of attached to in order to be fertilized. These types of plants, the ones that are growing in the ground, there's usually a lot more nutrients around them and around their roots, so they're used to a more steady supply of nutrition, and there's different elements that you need to consider, so a denser soil mix, things like that. So there is going to be differences. You need to start thinking about this when you're looking at your components. The other thing that you need to remember when you're looking at what type of growing media you want to be using is the watering needs of that plant. So for instance, an alocasia or a colocasia, that generally the big alocasias or colocasias that grow near kind of running water or rivers and things like that, they need a lot of moisture all of the time. Something, for instance, like an air plant, let's go to the full extreme of that, or even a cactus. They're not, so the air plants will be getting the moisture a lot of the time from the air or from the rain that's falling in. They don't generally have roots other than to anchor themselves onto something, which what makes air plants really unique. But for instance, a cactus, if they're growing in a very desert type of environment, it doesn't mean they survive on no water. It just means that they get very infrequent water, and they get water that kind of comes in flush floods and flush rain, and then it drains away really quickly. So these are the things that you need to remember. On the flip side of that is, what are you growing the plant and the media? What is the media and the plant in? So what's your vessel of choice? Is it plastic? Is it plastic with holes? Is it, so let me give you some examples, hold on. So is it going to be a plastic, apologies for how dirty this is, but this is a pot that I use quite frequently. So this is a plastic pot, it's a clear pot with holes for more aeration. This is a decorative pot that I would have it in there, but some people will grow their plants in pots without drainage holes. That's another thing you can remember. Also, how many or how large of a drainage hole is there at the bottom? Does the water drain quickly, or does it take a while to drain out? Are you growing in something like terracotta? These are all things that you're gonna need to consider when you're choosing the soil type media, or even your semi-hydro media as well. And also, let's be real, the watering personality of your odd plant as well. So for instance, if you know that certain plants like very, very specific watering, like, you're gonna need to be taking that into consideration when you are choosing what media you're going to grow it in. What are the components of that media? And I've left the last thing, the most important thing is last, is you and your personality and what you can do. If you class yourself as an underwater, that's going to signify that you might need to use slightly different components than somebody who might be an overwater. So we might both be growing the same plants. You're an underwater, I'm an overwater. That plant is still going to have the same needs. It's going to be coming from the same part of the world. Like that, it's the same plant. That element does not change, but how you and me are going to be treating that plant will change, which means that our growing medias might vary quite drastically in order to make it so that plant is happy within what we can provide for it. That makes sense? But let's look at some of the classics. I'll start off with something that has been around for a very long time, even though people don't necessarily realize it, is leca. So leca stands for light expanded clay aggregate, if I'm not mistaken. And it's essentially just a bit of puffed clay, if I'm not mistaken again. And it is very good because it has got great capacity for capillary action. And that just means it's able to kind of move water upwards. So if you've ever seen a pot with loads of like leca stacked on top of each other and you've got like some water at the bottom of it, the capillary action that you'll see, if the leca is dry, you'll see that water slowly start to be sucked up from the bottom and go upwards, because that is working through capillary action. Each one of those leca balls is absorbing the water. If it's touching another leca ball, that leca ball starts absorbing water from that touch point. So they're very, very good for capillary action. Also, because of their size, because of the fact that they're spheres, they're really good for aeration. However, leca is one of those materials that maybe has a bit of a headache when you're first growing, especially if you're going to be growing semi-hydro and you're only going to be growing in leca. So there's not going to be anything else but leca. So there's things that you need to consider. It might be dusty. You need to wash it before you use it. It's also something that might kind of get a lot of mineral buildup because of that capillary action. So you might need to do more regular flushes. I'm not going to go into the pros and cons of leca, but these are things that you're going to need to consider. Also something to bear in mind with a lot of the semi-hydro materials versus the more traditional soil mix materials, you can use a lot of the semi-hydro materials in soil mixes. You can put leca in a soil mix. You can put a lot of the other stuff like zeolite, pumice stone, all of these things. You can still put it in your soil mixes. They don't just have to be for semi-hydro. It works that way. It doesn't work the other way a lot of the time. So you can't take soil mix type materials and put them into your semi-hydro because of a reason that's going to come up a bit later on in the video. Let's move on to something again that's chunky and kind of something that we're used to utilizing, say orchid bark. So orchid bark, the thing that we will use a lot of the times in its purest form, just the orchid bark, if you're growing something like a Phalaenopsis orchid. That is something that is utilized a lot for them because of all of its different kind of benefits. So it's airy, it's chunky, it also retains some moisture, it can also retain some nutrients as well. So that is why it's used a lot of the time for orchids, because orchids generally for their roots need it. Not all orchids, but the ones that we're used to, the more common orchids that we can find, they need a lot of air that goes to their roots, but they also need some moisture available to them. So that's really good. However, and this is something that a lot of people don't necessarily discuss, if you've got orchid bark within a soil media, it still provides you that kind of chunkiness, that moisture hold, that kind of aeration that's going to happen. However, because it's organic, unlike leca, which is inorganic, just giving you some dip as to what I was talking about before, it will break down. And by breakdown, essentially, it's a slightly nicer way of saying it will rot. So as you might see with a fallen log in a forest somewhere and it's not attached to anything, it's dry wood, eventually it will start rotting away. It will start decomposing. That will also happen with orchid bark after a long period of time, because you need to remember it's not something that's out in the open and staying dry all the time. It's within a wet media for a large chunk of its time. It will start decomposing. What this might mean is you might get fluctuations in your pH and all of these things. And that's something that people, again, don't always talk about, because people that grow just in orchid bark and they're just growing some orchids in orchid bark, they know with orchid bark, if they're going to use it, they need to refresh that media every few years, because that bark isn't good anymore. It's actually going to cause more harm. It's going to potentially introduce more rot into the plant. But it's not something that people say a lot of the times when you're looking at your own soil mixes for your plants, because if you think about 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line, that bark that you've put on there is possibly going to be decomposing. And if you are not repotting or uppotting your plant because it's getting bigger, and even then, if you're not removing all of those particles, you might still have little bits of rot that are happening that are changing the pH or changing all of these things and potentially are in contact with some of your roots that could be introducing some pathogens. And again, you need to remember with the kind of orchid bark, there are different materials. I think there's fir, there's pine, there's a whole different host of different things that you can use as orchid bark. There's also cocoa husks that you can use now in kind of lieu of more traditional orchid bark. There's all of these different things and they're all going to behave in different ways. So for instance, I know that a lot of people like using cocoa chunks. Cocoa chunks, however, will decompose faster than the more traditional orchid bark that you get in just orchid bark bags, just because of the way that the structure of the material is. So again, something to remember there. But ultimately, one of the main reasons why a lot of people love using orchid bark, other than the kind of aeration element, is it's very reminiscent to what the plant is probably growing in nature, in the forest floor. You will find leaf litter, you will find bits of broken wood. It makes sense. It's kind of very, very similar to what some of these plants are expecting, not just for the terrestrial plants, but also the epiphytic plants. Essentially, if they're in the nook and cranny of a tree, they're right next to bark. Bits of bark will be falling into that little growing space that the roots have gone into. They're used to having bark around them. Let's go on to the big one now with a lot of soil mixes, and this tends to be the bulk of most soil mixes, is coco coir these days. It used to be that people would use peat moss, but peat moss, it's good that we're not touching it anymore. There are reasons why we should be moving away from peat moss. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this video, but the big alternative that people are using now is coco coir. I will also acknowledge that coco coir has also got its own set of issues, but because it's one of the materials that is so widely used within houseplants and soil mixes for houseplants, it needs to be kind of mentioned here. So it is very, very good at retaining moisture, but unless it's very, very fluffy, it's not great at aeration. So this is really good at holding the moisture, but there's not going to be a lot of air that's coming in. And even when you get certain things from stores, you might get them a lot of times and it's 100% coco coir and it's very, very fluffy. After a while, that might compact. It will kind of drop down and kind of create even less air. And then you wonder what's happened. It was growing happily in the soil media. That soil element, which is pure coco coir, has changed over time because of compaction, because of all of these things. If it's dried a bit too much, it can become hydrophobic. Hydrophobic is when it repels water. It becomes so dry that no water can penetrate it. But the big thing with coco coir generally is, and I think you've probably got it from this little section, is don't use it on its own. It's great when it's mixed into other elements that might introduce more aeration. And let's talk about the two big things, which again are inorganic as far as I'm aware, which is perlite and vermiculite. And I'm sure people might know already, but for the people that don't know, both of those essentially just think of it as rock popcorn. It is essentially kind of puffed up stones as far as I'm aware, or it's kind of coming from a mineral material. So you might not necessarily think of it. Perlite is obviously we're all very used to seeing perlite. It's been around since, like, even when I was a kid in the 80s. It is something that almost looks like kind of polystyrene balls. And for both perlite and vermiculite, anybody that has grown it in mixes, and we still all use it, it does float and it does get everywhere and it's very, very light. And that's part of its thing. It is a good growing media to kind of add into a mix because it creates that aeration and that lightness. However, obviously you get that floating that I was just mentioning. The same thing goes for actually the bigger thing that you need to remember, the difference between vermiculite and perlite is vermiculite is a bit better at holding onto moisture a bit more. So vermiculite tends to be used more for plants that have got very, very fine roots. It's used a lot for like seedlings, because it makes it really super easy for those finer roots, those early roots if it's a seedling, or those finer roots if it's a plant that has got very fine roots, to be able to get into nooks and crannies, and it's fluffy basically. But let's have a look at the semi-hydro, or the mineral crew as I like to call them. So the first big one is pumice. So pumice is something that anybody, I don't know if pumice, more traditional pumice is still used for this, but if anybody, we're getting on a slightly tangent here, but like if anybody like has got like really hard skin at the bottom of their feet, usually you get a pumice stone to kind of like grate that off essentially. And the reason for that, there's a reason why I'm saying this, I'm sorry to like eke everybody out, but it's because pumice stone in itself, and it is a volcanic type of stone. Trying to think now, are all stones volcanic? They might be, they might not be. Geologists, don't come to me. But it's got a lot of like pockets within it. So the way that it's structured, it's got a lot of bits of air that can kind of go in. That's why obviously you use it for that medical reason, basically, or that beauty reason. But it also means it's quite good in small chunks within kind of a semi-hydro mix. Again, I'm not going to say this for the whole of this section, but a lot of these materials will also be usable if you're using them in mixes of soil as well. Pumice is a great one to use as an alternative. It's more expensive, but as an alternative to perlite, because it has very similar kind of benefits, but it's heavier. It's a lot heavier, so it won't float. But you also, the downside of that is it is heavier. So it means that if you've got a lot of pumice within a soil mix, that pot is going to be a lot heavier as well. So something to remember. But yes, it does have that aeration, which means it can kind of trap some of that moisture within those little kind of pockets. And obviously, because it is heavy, it can add some structure and stability to the plant as well. Now, lava rock, and I know there's been a lot of debate within the community, because lava rock, and especially when you get semi-hydro mixes, and it's just like pumice and zeolite and lava rock, and everybody's just like, but lava rock, all the rest of it is more or less lava rock as well. But what is classed as lava rock within these types of mixes, or what you can buy to mix your own semi-hydro mixture, is something that is similar to pumice, obviously, but it's slightly heavier still. So that again will give you some of that stability and some of that weight that you need. And again, it has similar kind of elements. If you look at how each of these little bits of lava rock look under a microscope, and if I've got some of that original video that I filmed under kind of like a large magnification, I'll see if I can add it here so you can kind of see what it looks like up close. It might not always be visible in the naked eye, but you should be able to see those kind of structures, which will help kind of with that water retention as well. And then you've got the kind of newer player on the block, which isn't really that new, but it's something that I think in more recent years has become a bit more of a bigger thing in semi-hydro mixes, which is zeolite. And that tends to be the rocks that you might see within a semi-hydro mix, or if you're mixing it together yourself, it's kind of slightly green, slightly blue, powdery green, powdery blue. It's that kind of coloration there. And it is great for cation exchange, and I will explain what cation exchange is here very, very briefly. But it is good not just to hold some of the moisture, but also to retain some of that nutrients. And with something like semi-hydro, where essentially all of these materials that I've just mentioned for semi-hydro, they're all inert. They're all mineral materials, which means they don't have any of their own properties. Yes, some salts might be coming off the back of some of these materials, but they do not hold any of the nutrients that plants that are growing in soil might find within the soil mixes themselves. So they are inert. That's what I mean. The other materials we were just talking about before, a lot of them, not all of them, but the ones that are more kind of organic that we were mentioning before for the soil mixes, they tend to have some nutrition within them, essentially, some of the micro trace elements as well. Obviously, you still need to fertilize, but with semi-hydro, all of these, because they're fully inert, you are fully responsible for fertilizing. So that fact that the zeolite can hold onto that some nutrition a bit longer than some of those other elements is going to be a boon to you at that point. Now let's talk about additives and what they actually do. So these are extra elements that you don't necessarily need to add into your soil mixes, but some people do like to kind of go the extra mile and add them in. First one being activated charcoal, and essentially it is a form of charcoal. You might see this if you've ever had fish or fish tanks, more specifically, if I'm not mistaken. Some of their filtration system has got activated charcoal. And what this is, and what it does essentially when you're looking at some of your plant mixtures or your soil mixers, it's good at like trapping some bad odors as well. Like if you've never tried this before, you can add like some, in a bowl, some loose activated charcoal in your fridge. And if your fridge smells bad, it will absorb some of those bad smells. It also sweetens the soil, and I'll explain what that means here. But it is one of those things that a lot of people just like, use it, use it, use it. It has a lot of benefits. You don't have to. And it can help, but it's not, none of these additives are miracle ingredients. They are just kind of supporting actors to the whole thing. They will never be kind of main character energy. They were always going to be supporting characters. Activated charcoal tends to be better as well in wetter medias, especially in something like terrariums as well, something that stays a bit wetter for longer. It will help a lot with that. And as well, because of the way that it is, and because it's got a slightly more robust structure, it can also help a tiny bit with aeration. You're not going to be using enough of it to really make a huge difference. Look at some of the other ingredients that I was talking about earlier on for larger quantities. And also, if I'm not mistaken, activated charcoal generally, like if you're getting a very large bag of perlite versus a very large bag of activated charcoal, the activated charcoal will be considerably more expensive than the perlite. So it's not something you want to be adding in huge amounts in anyway. And then you've got worm castings, worm poo. So yes, essentially that is what worm casting is. It is what worms would excrete, essentially. And as you would imagine, it is essentially a very good form of slow release fertilizer. And by very good, maybe I'm exaggerating there. It's a good form of slow release fertilizer. It's not going to be your only one, and it's not going to provide all the nutrients that your plants are going to need, because also, remember, it's not replenishing itself. You don't have worms growing in your growing media and replenishing the worm castings on a frequent basis, which means that at some point the nutrients that are coming in from the worm castings are going to be absorbed by the plant. Even if they are slow release, they will be eventually absorbed from the plant, which also means that you don't need huge numbers. And again, remember, because this is a form of slow release fertilizer, you don't want to be dumping a whole bunch of this. Also, it's not cheap, but you don't want to be dumping a whole bunch of this into your plant, because it's like you sitting there and just watering a plant straight, neat. This is maybe an extreme example, but similar vibes to you just opening a bottle of fertilizer and just going glug, 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 glug on top of the plant. You don't need to do that. Small amounts should be fine, but you can replenish some worm castings, maybe a tiny bit as a top dressing, every 6 months to a year, as long as you haven't added too much. Again, the thing that I will always say about the additives is you don't need to go crazy with them. Small amounts are fine. The other big thing is going to be things like the more traditional slow release fertilizer pellets. So these are not organic, these are something that are man-made, and you might see them as little yellow balls, and you'll see them both in semi-hydro mixes and in soil mixes, and they will behave slightly differently in both of those. So that is something to bear in mind. But again, much like the worm castings, there is a point where they deplete. And even though you might still see those yellow balls there, they don't, like, I think a lot of people when they're first starting off, they're just like, oh, but I can still see them. There's obviously still fertilizer there. It doesn't work that way. You will probably still see them even after they've been depleted. So you still need to top up every so often. And the other thing as well, and I've done a whole video in this plant series, and I'll see if I can link that specifically there, is something like mycorrhizal fungi. And I've said in that video why it's a bit redundant to call it mycorrhizal fungi, because mycorrhizal, it's part of the word, basically. It's a fungus, basically. But it isn't necessary, but it does help a bit with water regulation in plants, especially if you are an underwaterer. Sometimes it can help because it will attach these kind of hyphae from the actual fungi will attach to the roots of your plant, and it does help them a bit in drought situations to have less of a shock. So it means that they will be better adept at handling drought conditions, which is most of the time a very common thing for a lot of the underwaterers, is that You're an underwaterer. The plant might need a touch more water, but you kind of water a bit less. And on behalf of everybody who's an overwaterer, big respect for you, because generally speaking, you probably will do less damage to your plants than a lot of us overwaterers. Do not argue in the comments, please. I've just realized that I might be opening a can of worms there. in my humblest of opinions, it doesn't, not everybody has to agree with it. And let's touch briefly on putting it all together. So remember what we talked about earlier on in the video is you need to take into consideration everything. Take into consideration if you're an overwaterer, if you're an underwaterer, what pot, what plant, where they're used to growing. All of these things are going to come together to help you decide what mix you're going to put into things. So for instance, if you've got a plant that is an epiphyte and it's an epiphyte that really wants an awful lot of air and it's used to growing in the smallest of nooks and crannies, but there's not an awful lot of leaf debris around them, putting it in something like pure cocoa coir is a very fast way of making sure that that plant will die a fast death, either through root rot or kind of like root suffocation, basically. So you just need to be smart in how you're going to utilize these kind of different elements and how you mix them in as well. So again, I'll give you an example. You and me might use exactly the same material. So if we go to bog standard kind of houseplant mix and you're using some cocoa coir, maybe some perlite, maybe nothing else, maybe a touch of a worm castings, but that is pretty much it. How these were different. Say you and me are growing an aglaonema, like I was showing you before. And how would we both have different soil mixes, same plant, say we're both using the same pot as well, how would it differ if I'm an overwaterer and you're an underwaterer? So if I'm an overwaterer, I'm going to want to put as much aeration. So for instance, it might be 60%, 70% perlite versus 30% cocoa coir, because I know I'm going to maybe water it a bit more than I should. So making sure that that water sloughs off a bit faster and doesn't stay dense and wet for so long is going to ensure that I'm going to give that plant the best chance of success based on the care that I'm going to give it. However, if you are an underwaterer, you might flip that ratio around and say, I need 70% cocoa coir and 30% perlite, because Memo might water it every week. I'm likely to forget and probably only water it once a month. So that moisture does need to remain a bit more. There's a fine balance for both extremes, both the overwaterers and the underwaterers, that you need to kind of experiment a bit with. But that could be the difference between your care specifically and not just what the plant needs or what the pot that it's in is. But again, if we're looking at the plant specifically, a Hoya is going to have different needs to an alocasia, because if a Hoya is used to growing epiphytically and alocasia is used to growing terrestrially, it's going to be different. Same thing goes, and even if you don't look at things within different genuses, if you look at, say, the Philodendron esmeraldense versus something like the Philodendron pastazanum, or Philodendron gloriosum, which are very much ground dwelling and they are crawlers and they stay on the ground. A lot of the other philodendrons might climb up, so they might start terrestrially sometimes, not always, and then become epiphytic, or at least hemiepiphytic, semi-epiphytic, because they've still got some roots in the ground, but they're also attaching to the trees or anything else that they're giving support, which is why a lot of people use moss poles. They're emulating that. So those two plants, same genus, they're both philodendrons, are going to be very different in their soil needs, and you need to remember that as well. So one is used to slightly more denser soil and a bit more fertilizer around its roots all the time, and maybe the roots are a bit finer. If you've ever seen the roots of a Philodendron gloriosum, the roots are very fine, versus something that might be more of a climbing philodendron, which might have chunkier roots because it needs to attach to things as well and it's used to more air. Things to remember when you're choosing not just the mix of ingredients, but also the percentages of how you're going to mix things together. Again, same thing goes before, like you might need a denser mix because it's what it's used to getting, and maybe a bit more of the slow release fertilizers or the worm castings for something like a gloriosum because that's what it's used to because it's terrestrial, versus less of that for something like the esmeraldens because it's more on the epiphytic side. So it's not used to having such dense soil or so much nutrition all the time. See how those two things are different? And you also need to remember how your mixes are going to evolve over time. We talked before about orchid bark decomposing. We talked about cocoa coir compacting, making sure that the kind of more mineral side of things has still got some of that elements within it and it's not all getting flushed away or it's not all staying locked within each other. These are things that you're going to need to consider, because I am sorry to be the bearer of bad news. When it comes to any form of growing media, it's not a set it and forget it for the next 10 to 15 years. I know people have done it, and I know people have grown successfully like that, but it's not the ideal conditions. And if you want to give your plants more of an ideal conditions and get more consistent, faster, stable growth, you need to consider about how these materials are also going to fare over time and at what point do you need to refresh that. How about some quick common mistakes? So one of the things that a lot of people might end up doing is over compacting something, even if it's a light and airy and they've spent all of this time and they've researched and they found the materials and they found the mix that works for them, or they bought a pre-done mix and they use it and they put it in a pot and then they squish everything down. Guess what you have just done? You know, all of that time and money that you spent in order to bring all of that aeration to something like might be epiphytic, something that wants a lot of air in there, you have just squished it all out there. Wasted all of your time and money at that point. What you can do and what a lot of growers will do, and let me bring up a pot to show you. I mean, obviously this is a decorated pot, but say I was just about to put some soil and I filled this up with soil, just loosely filled it up with soil. Instead of me going, squish, 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 what you can do is just gently tap, 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 tap on the side, maybe tap it down on the thing, and things will fall into places, but you'll still get to keep a lot of that air, because I know as well as everybody else that has ever made a super airy mix, maybe something that you're doing for an anthurium, if you just put it in straight and don't do any form of tap, tap, tap or anything like that, the plant will just flop over. There's not enough of that stability that it needs to stabilize itself. So you do need to make it a bit more stable, but don't like squish, squish, squish down, because you are literally pushing out all of those air bubbles that you spent time and money doing. Tap, 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 and it will kind of settle in a place where you still get some of that air without it being fully compacted. The other big common mistake is too much air or too little air. So both extreme examples, and I think, and it's such a shame that I don't think he's around anymore on YouTube, but I think it was Legends of Monstera, and he was doing an example of showing people kind of like extremes. So you could have something that's very dense soil and something that has some aeration and something that has a bit more aeration, or then something that's just grown in something like orchid bark, and then just something grown with nothing. Like how you would get some orchids just growing like an air plant, for instance, and how much the watering level and how often you need to do changes throughout all of these things. So the thing that keeps a lot of water, you might not need to water more than once a month. Maybe, and going down from that list, it might be every 2 weeks, every 1 week, something that doesn't have anything on its roots, you might need to manually be watering that once or twice a day. So just make sure that you are making the right mix of ingredients as well, just so you don't end up having to water every single one of your plants like twice a day. Or on the flip side of that, if you're letting plants stay wet, even if it's too dense, and you don't have enough aeration and you're only watering once a month, you're just like, oh, this is great, I don't have to like give them as much care. But probably what's happening is there's no air left in that plant for a very long period of time in terms of its roots, and you could be introducing things like root rot. And the big final one on here as well is adding too much of the goodies, adding too much of the like slow release fertilizer, too much of the mycorrhizal fungi, too much of the worm castings. You don't, just because somebody on the internet told you that use loads, it doesn't mean that it's correct. Experiment with that, see what works for you as well. And listen to what other people have done and what has worked. Don't just say like, oh yes, I've got to use all of these things. Even more so if somebody's sitting there going, use loads of these, and it's like a sponsored video, and it's just like, Most people are giving honest opinions, but ultimately at that particular moment in time, they're trying to give you all the benefits. So you use more, you know what I mean. So use your common sense and some judgment there. It doesn't need a lot of a good thing. It's the same thing as like, and apologies for anybody who's struggling with any form of kind of addiction or even alcohol kind of addiction. You can go out for a drink of, say, a glass of wine or anything like that, like once a week or once a month, and it's fine. But there's a huge difference between you doing that and you having 17 bottles of wine a night to yourself. See what I mean? But yes, I think I'll leave you there because this video is already quite long. You know that I like to geek out about these things with all of you, so cut me some slack. But what I want to know now is, what do you think? Have I missed? I probably have missed quite a few ingredients here, but I've gone for the big ones. Have I missed something that you think should be on here? I can see the one already that everybody, is it fluval stratum or something like that? And I need to find the bag that I have of that somewhere because it was given to me years ago. And somebody was just like, try this. And I'm just like, I will, and I haven't got around to it yet. I do need to try it. I do know, I promise you I will, but I can't talk to that because I have never experienced it by my own laziness. But if you've had experience with that, let us all know down below. And I know there's a lot of other materials. If I've missed any that you think need to be highlighted or people introduced to them, please do let people know down below. And yeah, tell us maybe some of the mixes that worked for you or didn't work for you, or things that could work for some people but for some reason didn't work for you, or things that shouldn't work that have worked for you. Like for example, I think it surprises a lot of people to know that I grow a lot of my prayer plants, which are supposed to be moisture loving plants, in very, very, very light aroid soil mixes. Very light. And again, we were talking before about epiphytic versus terrestrial. Most prayer plants are terrestrial plants, so they would be used to slightly denser soil. However, because I'm an overwaterer, even for a plant that likes to have moisture around all the time, a very airy aroid soil mix means that it balances my crazy out versus the plant's crazy, if that makes sense. But yeah, I shall let you go. Hopefully you enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.